But last week I had seen this article about one of the first sort of quasi-wind-powered cargo ships that was leaving from Australia. And it was this big celebratory article, yay, we're finally decarbonising shipping by moving to these wind-powered cargo ships. What do you think the ship's carrying?
Is it gas or coal?
It's coal. It's coal. So, great that we're signing on to things like this,
yeah,
but also
we're still using it to ship massive amounts of coal overseas.
And at the end of the day, what is fueling the climate crisis? It's fossil fuels. And who is one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world? It's Australia.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. Over 100 world leaders have begun arriving in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. That's the United Nations annual climate conference. This year it's in Egypt.
The annual UN Climate Summit, or COP27, a pivotal conference in Egypt to discuss climate change.
35,000 delegates are expected to attend COP27 this week, including 100 world leaders.
We are on a highway to climate hell, with our foot still on the accelerator.
Is that it does seem to be that we're pretty much guaranteed to shoot through 1.5 degrees warming.
Australia is experiencing more frequent fires and floods.
We need to dramatically reduce our use of gas.
Both Labor and Coalition, who spruiked more coal and gas, can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it.
The precious places, landscapes, animals and plants that we think of when we think of home may not be here for our kids and grandkids.
Would for me be considered a success or a step forward would be that more people realise what a scam it actually is.
And as the summit kicks off, climate action is high on the international agenda and the domestic agenda. The Australia Institute's Climate of the Nation report is the country's longest running survey of community attitudes to climate change, and it provides a comprehensive account of changing Australian beliefs and attitudes towards climate change, including its causes, impacts and solutions. The 2022 report was launched last week at the Australian Museum by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull.
And what we saw at the last election was a large section of that base of the Liberal Party vote for the independents, so-called teal independents. And you now have, in a parliament of 151 seats, you have 9 hitherto solidly safe Liberal seats sitting on the crossbench occupied by these smaller Liberal, climate progressive independents. And what that tells you is that the Liberal Party, by failing to respond to the need for climate action sufficiently, by being held back by that combination of vested interest in fossil fuel sector, right-wing media and right-wing populist politics, what it's done is it's neglected that base and eventually a part of it has walked away.
The report provides an insight into what Australians are thinking and feeling about climate change and the climate policies they support. It's an interesting year, given the transformative Australian election results from earlier this year, which delivered a climate supermajority into the Parliament after almost a decade of climate inaction and delay. With me today is the report author and climate and energy researcher Audrey Quick to take us through the results and what they mean for climate action in Australia. G'day, Audrey.
Hi, Ebony. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, as I said, 2022 has been a very big year for climate. We've got a new federal government, a new parliament, and we're about to enter our third La Nina summer with floods still devastating large parts of Australia's east coast. And to boot, there's also a global energy crisis. What are the major findings from this year's Climate of the Nation report, Audrey?
Wow, when you put it like that, it has been a big year, hasn't it? Firstly, we see that the number of Australians that are concerned about climate change is at record high levels this year. And of course, you've just named all of these things that have been going on throughout the year. I think it's unsurprising, but we do see that it's 75% of Australians are concerned about climate change. And so that's the same level of concern that we saw last year, and it is the highest since Climate of the Nation began tracking about 15 years ago. Then when we dig down into some of those climate impacts that people are worried about, we see that it's things like increased flooding. That's one of the biggest concerns. Things like more bushfires and the extinction of plant and animal species. And again, this isn't surprising. You know, if we look back over this past year, we've got those East Coast floods. We've got many people who are still recovering from those Black Summer bushfires. And we even had the release of Australia's State of the Environment report this year that painted quite a shocking picture of environmental decline. So again, not surprising that that's the sort of concern that we're seeing in this year's report. We also see that there's this really strong support for a transition away from fossil fuel use in Australia. So that's in industry, in homes, in transport. The vast majority of respondents, so about 79% of Australians, believe that we should be phasing out coal-fired power in Australia. So that includes about half that think we should be phasing it out gradually and managing those costs over time, and about a third that think we should be phasing it out as soon as possible.
Like much more rapidly, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. But then not only rapidly, we also see that they want that transition to be properly managed by government. So 3/4 of respondents agree that governments really should be implementing a plan to ensure that orderly closure of coal plants.
Yeah, because we haven't exactly, it doesn't feel like we've had an orderly or a planned energy policy in quite some time. So I guess it's not surprising to see that concern come through in the results. People want to know that this is being managed. It's not just happening randomly according to the market.
Exactly, and I think it's not just about phasing out of those coal power stations, but what we're phasing into. They want to see that management of phasing into clean energy sources and really reaping the benefits of those new energy sources.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that really shows up in the results this year is, I think, a sort of growing frustration around the poor management of our natural resources. So we see that something that is quite strongly supported is a windfall profits tax. So a windfall profits tax, particularly on our oil and gas industry, it's about 61% of Australians would support this. And, you know, Australia is one of the biggest fossil fuel exporters in the world, but while the fossil fuel industry is reaping those record profits, little of that is going to the Australian public. So again, it's not surprising that so many Australians really want to see some of that profit going into public hands rather than private.
Yeah, because it's Australian households that are essentially paying those record gas prices at the moment in particular. So they're really kind of bearing the brunt of some of that stuff.
It is why I am asking that all governments tax the windfall profits of fossil fuel companies.
No new coal-fired power stations.
President Biden yesterday escalated weeks of sharp warnings to energy producers, floating a so-called windfall tax on their corporate profits.
Fossil fuel companies a hard time. Yeah, look, they should be using the super profits right now, Patricia, to be going green, to be giving their consumers energy which doesn't harm the children, cook the planet.
Dozens of towns across New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia are facing the threat of inundation as floods move downstream. The crisis expected to worsen over coming days.
But that's really interesting, Audrey. We've got, it sounds like a lot of concern around climate impacts that people are experiencing right at this moment, and then just a lot of concern and support for policies to really tackle that transition and get away from fossil fuels.
Exactly. And we also see a lot of support for a levy on fossil fuel exports that would then go to funding some of those climate disasters that you were talking about earlier.
It sounds like there is really strong support for moving away from fossil fuel generation and exports, as you said, and I guess quite encouraging to hear that support for some kind of a levy on fossil fuel exports to help all those devastated Australian communities really build back after all the, you know, extreme weather that they're experiencing. But you also found that a lot of Australians continue to really overestimate the value of the fossil fuel industry. That's something that we kind of hear a lot in the news. You know, it's the backbone of the Australian economy and it's so big and it creates so many jobs, but people really overestimate the size of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you the fossil fuel industry has done a very good job of convincing Australians.
It's got amazing PR. Congratulations.
Exactly. So what we see is we ask about two things. We ask about how many people they think that those industries employ and how much money they think is going from those industries into Australian GDP. And both of those values are way, way overestimated. So on average, most Australians think coal mining employs around 10% of our workforce.
So 1 in every 10 workers employed in coal mining.
When in fact, it's more like 0.3%. So
less than half of 1%, you're telling me?
Exactly, yes.
Oh, that's quite a bit smaller, Audrey.
Oh, just a tad. And then they also think that coal mining accounts for around 13% of Australia's GDP. And again, that's more like 1.4%. So again, a massive overestimation. And then we see sort of similar figures for the gas industry, but in fact there Australians are even more likely to overestimate the value.
Yeah, right, because it's even, I do know this from previous discussions, it's even smaller than the coal industry essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. So much for that gas-fired recovery, hey?
The shift to zero emission vehicles is essential to Australia's climate ambitions, to our fuel security and to easing cost of living pressures on households. With global supply likely to be constrained for several years, Australia must act immediately to create a viable mass market for electric vehicles.
Audrey, I know that this year, for the first time, Climate of the Nation included a transport chapter. Why is that important?
Transport in Australia is a really high emitting sector, firstly. So it's around the third highest emitting sector, contributes about 18% of our overall emissions. But importantly, it's rising. It's not an area where we have so far been able to bring down emissions. So it really is an area that we need to start focusing on in terms of decarbonisation. We're not going to get to net zero by 2050 if we don't start implementing policies to decarbonise transport.
And so you looked at a number of those policies. What did you find?
Yeah, so we found that firstly there is really strong support for a whole range of electric vehicle policies. I think we ask about 9 different electric vehicle policies and we get really strong support for all of them. So this is things like implementing a network of fast charging stations across Australia, requiring all new apartment blocks to have charging stations in them when they're built.
Yeah, because that's a big problem. Like, not everyone lives in a house with a freestanding garage where you can plug something into the wall.
Exactly. So going forward, we will have charging stations in all of those sort of new build apartments, and then we're going to have to look at retrofitting some of those old apartments as well to make sure that everyone has access and can actually charge their vehicle. And we see in the results that those are policies that are very strongly supported. We also see that there's strong support for subsidies, so something that's going to reduce that upfront cost of the vehicle, make it more accessible to everyday Australians to actually go out and purchase one, and also strong support for fuel efficiency standards in line with the similar standards that they have in Europe, which would make a massive difference in Australia.
So it would really change the kind of cars that Australia has access to in the marketplace, because we know a lot of car manufacturers are taking those most highly efficient and zero emissions cars and they're selling them where they're kind of forced to by other high fuel efficiency standards. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. What the fuel efficiency standards would do is, as you said, act as a big incentive for those manufacturers to be placing those more efficient vehicles here so they avoid a penalty.
And I wanted to ask you about public transport and active transport, because I feel like a lot of the discussion around transport always talks about cars, but active transport is kind of where we need to be, and public transport is so important for so many people. Like, ideally in future, everyone would have access to great public transport, or they're going to be close enough to be riding their bike to work or having access to accessible and active transport like that. Did you ask any questions around those kinds of policies?
Yeah, we did. And you're absolutely right. They're a vital piece of the transport decarbonisation puzzle. We're not going to decarbonise transport just by focusing on electric vehicle policies. So we asked a lot about active transport. And firstly, what we see is that respondents agree that governments really should be introducing policies that encourage that shift away from car use, which Australians are so used to, and towards public transportation and active transport, so cycling and walking, things like that. We see that the vast majority, 80%, want to see modified streets and sidewalks and crosswalks to encourage walking for people of all ages and abilities.
Yeah, that makes sense because whether it's walking as a pedestrian or riding on a bike, safety must be a big concern for a lot of people, like why they don't do it. It's a bit intimidating to ride along a major road, for example.
Absolutely, and we actually conducted focus groups as part of this year's Climate of the Nation study, and we heard from a lot of individuals in those focus groups exactly what you're saying, that they had some big safety concerns around walking, but also particularly around cycling, particularly from women and people with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
We heard that they would like to be using their car a lot less, but they just weren't able to with the kind of infrastructure that was around their homes. It was really hard to even get to public transport because they had sort of broken sidewalks, non-existent sidewalks, big highways in the way.
And I guess so much of our transport funding must go just directly to roads.
And actually, we did ask about that as well. So the United Nations recommends that 20% of a country's infrastructure spending go to active transport. We asked respondents how much do they think without telling them that.
Yep.
And on average, they think it should be about 20%. So bang on exactly
Bang
what
on
the
the
UN.
money.
Yeah.
And do you know how much we actually spend on active
I can tell you it's far, far less than that.
But active transport in cities is a good example.
Yeah.
It's not just that we switch to electric vehicles, everyone, but also we need to change the structures that we have in place. Walking, cycling, flying less. That's part of it.
As you've mentioned, Audrey, Australia has a very low uptake of electric vehicles, but the National Electric Vehicle Strategy is currently being developed by the government. What are some of the policies it's looking at, and do they have public support?
Yeah. So this is a really big opportunity because a lot of these policies that we polled in the Climate of the Nation, they're actually being spoken about right now, and the government is deliberating on whether to introduce them as part of this electric vehicle strategy. It's also quite exciting because Australia's been promised an EV strategy for so long, and now we are finally getting one. And I think it's interesting. We kind of have the benefit of hindsight here because we're so behind in this transition. We can look to other countries and actually see how they've gotten to where they are, what they've done, what worked, what didn't work.
So we can take some best practice policy from off the shelf. Someone's already tested it out somewhere else.
And as we should be doing. And one of the things that we do know is working overseas is these fuel efficiency standards. So they've been adopted in about 80% of the car market. It's quite ridiculous that we don't already have them here. That is number one priority, I would say, for this electric vehicle strategy is to implement fuel efficiency standards. They should be strong. They should be implemented as soon as possible. And really, they should phase out to 0 grams of CO2. So effectively banning the sale of new internal combustion engine cars from around 2030, 2035. That's actually something we poll, and we see that there's strong support for that.
That's encouraging. And I was going to ask you specifically, I know it's not exactly electric vehicles, but e-bikes. I'm really just asking for myself personally because I'm not a car person, Audrey. I've got one and I love it, but it's not where I want to spend my money the next time I have to buy a car. So I have been looking at e-bikes. What do we ask about e-bikes, and is there a lot of public support? Are people keen like me, or is it more in the electric vehicle space?
People are keen like you. I'm keen like you. Australians are keen like you. There are a few questions we asked about e-bikes, and firstly, we see that there's strong support for an e-bike subsidy program. So government funding about 30% off the price of an electric bike or a cargo bike or just a regular bike to help people purchase them. And we also see that people would support any subsidy that's going to an electric vehicle also being available for an electric bike as well. So there's definitely strong support there.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely something that we could see in this EV strategy. This is now the time that the government could be coming out and saying we will provide some subsidies for e-bikes and we'll include it in that EV strategy.
Yeah, I feel like I just need that little bit of help to get up the hills sometimes,
Yes,
and then I would ride a lot more.
And that is what the research shows, is that people do ride more if they have the e-bike, and they're replacing trips that they would otherwise have done in a car.
I feel like that would happen for me a lot. But acknowledging that I live, in a city with good access to things like that.
COP27 must be the place to rebuild trust and re-establish the ambition needed to avoid driving our planet over the climate cliff.
The world's wealthiest nations could have to pay compensation to poorer countries for damage caused by climate change. It is one of the issues on the agenda at this year's COP27 summit in Egypt.
Australia and its Pacific neighbours are among those most at risk.
The next thing I was going to ask is about COP27. Obviously, that's underway right at the moment in Egypt. Clearly, Australians are very concerned about climate change, and I think in the recent federal election results, we can see that climate change is clearly, something where they want to see some real action. Is that something we're likely to see at COP27 this year? How much ambition are we expecting?
I think at this year's COP, we're not likely to see the sort of ambition that we saw last year, and that's really because last year's COP was all about ambition.
Mm-hmm.
It was about putting forward ambitious pledges. And this year's COP is all about implementing them. So it's not going to be that sort of headline catching stuff that we saw last year, but there is still a big opportunity to make change, obviously.
Yep.
A big focus this year is going to be on climate finance, particularly. So things like recommitting to the Green Climate Fund is a big thing that Australia could be doing at this COP.
And why is climate finance important, just for people who aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah, so the Green Climate Fund is one form of climate finance, and it basically helps developing countries pay for the impacts of climate, and it's developed nations like Australia that put the money into those funds.
Okay. So Australia also at the moment is looking at trying to host a COP. Is that right?
Yeah, and actually that is something that we ask about in the Climate of the Nation, and we see that there's really strong support for Australia to host a COP. They have now officially said that they're going to be bidding to host COP31, so the one that's
like bidding for the Olympics.
So that's the COP that's in 2026. But look, to do so, they're really going to have to step up on their ambition. So we know that we have updated our NDC. So we're aiming for a 43% emissions reductions target.
Yep.
And that was stepping...
So that's our national target? That's what you're talking about there?
Yeah, so that's our national target. So that was definitely a step up. Is it ambitious enough? Probably not. Does it align with a 1.5 degree trajectory that we're meant to be doing under the Paris Agreement? No, not particularly.
And it kind of just looks good because the comparison is the Morrison government that was all the way down
exactly,
at
low bar.
24% or something.
Yeah.
But I did just want to come back to, if we're hosting a COP, a UN climate conference in Australia, surely, even though we're doing much better than we were, we need to be thinking about Australia's fossil fuel exports, because we're kind of the biggest exporter of LNG. We've got a pipeline of fossil fuel projects that are looking to be approved. We're not really moving away from fossil fuel exports. How is that going to jibe with the international community? Would it bring attention to the fact that Australia is a massive exporter of fossil fuels if we were to host a COP, do you think?
Absolutely. I don't see us hosting that COP if we don't do something about fossil fuel exports or fossil fuel subsidies, and if we continue to approve new coal, gas and oil projects. And we know that at the moment we've got about 100 projects in the pipeline, and there's really nothing in place to stop the approval of new gas and coal projects at the moment, that we are planning to go ahead with that. And so it really doesn't jive well that we want to host this big, ambitious climate conference here in Australia while still opening up new coal projects. And it was interesting, actually, today I saw that one of the things that Australia has done at COP just this morning was to sign on to this green shipping challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So this is this big global challenge to reduce emissions in the shipping industry. And it reminded me that last week I had seen this article about one of the first sort of quasi-wind-powered cargo ships that was leaving from Australia. And it was this big celebratory article, yay, we're finally decarbonising shipping by moving to these wind-powered cargo ships. What do you think the ship's carrying?
Is it gas or coal?
It's coal. It's coal. So, great that we're signing on to things like this,
yeah,
but also
we're still using it to ship massive amounts of coal overseas.
And at the end of the day, what is fueling the climate crisis? It's fossil fuels. And who is one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world? It's Australia.
Yeah. Certainly a lot to chew on there.
I think the biggest takeaway from this year's Climate of the Nation report is that, I think you said at the beginning, that we've sort of elected this new government and we have this climate majority in the Senate. Well, what we see in the results is that we can do more, and Australians will support it. We have a mandate to do more on climate action.
And a responsibility, as it turns out, as well. Thanks very much, Audrey. This episode was recorded live on Tuesday, the 8th of November 2022, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including the latest Climate of the Nation report, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Audrey Quick is at Audrey Quick, that's with an E on the end of Quick, and you can also keep up with all things COP by following Richie Merzian, our Climate and Energy Director, who's currently on the ground in Sharm el-Sheikh. His Twitter handle is at Richie Merzian, that's Merzian with a Z. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing from Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.